All right, we're ready to start whenever you are. Oh, we don't hear you. I think there's a little bit of an audio.
No, I just was muted.
All good.
Okay. Oh, so thank you so much for having me. I just want to thank everyone who coordinated this. Thank Katarina for reaching out to me and for your patience and, all of your time and for thinking of me for this. I really love to do public oriented work. And I just appreciate, you thinking of me for this and bringing me out and all of the work that you've put into the process. And just thank you all, like to all of the residents and everyone for having me and sharing a little bit of time with me today. So first, I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Jalondra A. Davis. I am a writer, I'm a scholar, I'm a professor at University of California, Riverside. And I'm a Black feminist scholar. I work on African diasporic, but primarily the African Americans in the United States, literary and cultural studies. And my specialization is in fantasy and science fiction, literature and culture. So I've done a lot of work over the years in terms of science fiction literature, but my current project, as you all know, is on African diasporic mermaid lore. I chose this project not really thinking about the Little Mermaid and not intending to really engage with the Little Mermaid as a text. But everything kind of happened, unfolded to where Halle Bailey was, cast as Ariel in the live action Little Mermaid. Around the same time, I started doing research on mermaids. So everything just kind of unfolded nicely to where I've been giving a platform to talk about a lot of my research. So my project is primarily looking at African diasporic mermaid lore in relationship to history. I'm really interested in the way that Black writers and creatives combine history with fantasy. So I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end, but I'm going to start off talking about mermaids a little bit more broadly. So I took a look at some of the questions. I'm not going to attempt to answer every question that was sent ahead because I want to leave something for the Q&A. But I did want to respond to the question in terms of how I became an expert on mermaids, how I got interested in this project. So I am a fantasy girl, fairy tale princesses. Like ever since I was a little girl, I just love those kinds of stories. And I think that for me, growing up in the late 80s, the 90s, fairy tale and princess stories were a lot of the stories that you would see where women were centered, right? So a lot of the kind of action and adventure, which were also things I enjoyed, you didn't really see women and girls being the center of those stories. So I think that's one of the reasons I always gravitated to this type of story. And so I loved mermaids. I love the mystery of mermaids. I think there's nothing that's more mysterious than the ocean because so much of it is unexplored and there's so much life in the ocean that we still don't know about. So I think there's a lot of mystery and magic and power that always attracted me to mermaids. In order to, I'm going to go ahead and share screen now and just tell you about show you rather than tell you about kind of my mermaid life, because mermaids has become, in these last couple years, it's become very all encompassing. So that's me in the middle in my mermaid tail. So I am actually a mermaid, and I will talk about what that means, but I want to show you just this little video.
It feels magical. It feels meditative. It feels really quiet. It's almost like time slows down. There's something about it.
So what you see me doing there is actually being a mermaid. There's actually a community of people who are mermaids. Many of these people are professional mermaids. I don't really consider myself a professional. I don't do performances or gigs, but professional mermaids do things like they swim in aquariums, they perform at children's birthday parties. They perform at corporate events. There is a mermaid bar. There's a dive bar in Sacramento where mermaids swim in the tank, right at the bar. There's a similar establishment in Florida. And this kind of aquatic performance has been around for a long time. Even if you go back to the early 20th century with the establishment of Weeki Wachee fair in Florida, where mermaids will perform in an underwater theater. So this kind of aquatic performance has been around for a long time, but over the last several years with social media, it's really just kind of exploded into this huge subculture and this huge community. So I want to play a little bit more about kind of my mermaid journey.
Idea than that of the mermaid. The early months of the pandemic, I was watching professional mermaid videos, and it was like stress relief. And that's what inspired me. And I've never had time before. I'm going to do this. So I finally took lessons. So it's like it actually motivated me. I'm still a baby mermaid because I'm still early in this journey. I just learned to swim a few years ago, partly because I have a young child and because I want to be a mermaid. I loved Disney growing up. I loved princesses.
Okay, so I just wanted to show you what it looks like, because when I describe this to people, they're like, you do what? So we swim with something called a monofin, and you pull this skin over it and you use like a dolphin kick motion to actually be a mermaid in the water. And it's like one of the most amazing things that I've ever done. So for me, this happened at the same time. I started writing about mermaid stories. I started noticing a lot more mermaid stories. I started noticing a lot more Black mermaid stories. I think that with Halle Bailey being cast as the Little Mermaid, and with some of the controversy and discussion around that, it really empowered a lot of Black women and people who had these kind of dreams before to actually come out and like start their mermaid businesses and write their mermaid books. So there's just been a flowering of Black mermaid lore that has also been a part of the larger mermaid renaissance I feel like we're having in popular culture right now, like from all cultures. So I am a scholar who studies this lore. And so on the left side, you'll see a photo of me with Wangechi Mutu's sculpture Water Woman. And Wangechi Mutu is a Kenyan American artist who created a whole exhibit around like African water spirits. So I flew to New York in order to look at this art, because I also write about art and literature and movies and professional mermaids, right? So it's an interdisciplinary project where I'm looking at a lot of different things. I also have a podcast called the Merwomanist podcast, where I talk about mermaid lore, again, from a Black feminist or womanist perspective. So that's a little bit about my mermaid life, who I am, how I got interested in this. For me, I started kind of doing mermaiding as self-care and stress relief, but it's also become a part of my research as well. Okay. All right, so I want to start off talking a little bit about the origins of mermaids. I think that was some of the questions people had. It's kind of like, where does this idea come from? First, before I go into this, mermaids, water spirits, I define mermaids really broadly. I don't think a mermaid is only a pretty girl with a tail, with a fish tail. I use mermaid to talk about any kind of idea of people or spirits who look like people who live in the water. That's really how I describe it. So if you use that definition, every single culture has mermaids. Every single culture has stories and myths and legends and water spirits, and many of these kind of evolve at the same time. So I don't think that there's one place we could point to like, oh, this is where they come from, because every culture has them. However, for the sake of time, I'm going to just kind of talk about sort of the genealogy or the development of Western, right? We're in the West, we're in the US, of kind of like Western mermaid lore. So most people trace it to the Greeks and the Romans with like the nymphs and the sirens. But I also actually trace it to the Middle East. Our first known example of a mermaid deity, because the original stories about all these things we now call mermaids, they're all deities, they're gods and they're goddesses and they're spirits. So the first example that we have of this is Atargatis, who is a goddess of Assyria, which is in what we now call Syria, which is part of what we now call the Middle East. Because, you know, we name all of these things retrospectively, right? Like this isn't the idea of the world we have now isn't the idea of the world the people who were living in it had, right? But the region we now call the Middle East, I'm identifying as the origin for kind of specifically part fish people. So Atargatis was a goddess of fertility, of both the earth and the waters, of rejuvenation, of rebirth, of growth, of bounty, right? You couldn't have any growth without Atargatis. But she's also very much known as a water goddess. One of the stories of Atargatis is that she fell in love with a shepherd. And during, I forgot to hit my timer. During lovemaking, she killed him. So he was a little overwhelmed. She's a goddess, she's powerful. And so out of her grief and her mourning for her lover, she jumps into the river where she is transformed into a fish, but the transformation is incomplete. So it's just her body or her lower body that becomes a fish. Now, most of the representations of Atargatis are of an anthropomorphic, meaning a human woman with legs. Like if you look at most of the statues of her, she's just depicted in a human woman form. But it's in the narrative, in the descriptions, in the stories where you sometimes hear her referred to as part fish, and fish and doves are both associated with her. But we do have this coin from 96 to somewhere between 96 and 87 BC that depicts her with a fish body. Okay. Another early deity we have is Oannes, who is a male water deity from ancient Babylonia. And he was like a fish man. So he was a huge fish, but he also had a head. He also had arms. He also had feet. So he could swim in the ocean, but he could also walk on land. And he is credited with giving the people wisdom and teaching them how to build their societies, teaching them how to build their kingdoms, and giving them order and wisdom and knowledge. So those are two early examples. They're both from the Middle East, and those eventually become kind of, you know, with Islam and with the rise of what we call Judeo-Christian religions. So that includes Islam, Judaism, Christianity. So with the rise of those religions, these figures transform from deities into kind of these lesser beings. And in the Arabic world, they're called Horyat Bar is a term for a mermaid, like a beautiful maiden of the water. And I actually forgot the term from the male version. The male version is the Isan Ama, which is man of the sea. So there are stories of these beings where they're still powerful, but they're not deities anymore. And they are also in these stories, they're always very careful. The mermaids are always very careful to say, I'm Muslim, right? So they very much inscribe themselves within the religion, right? So the ancient Islamic world, the ancient Middle Eastern world was always very closely connected with ancient Greek and Rome. So we get these kinds of figures travel into Greek mythology, but we don't start to see mermaids for quite some time, even in Greek mythology. What we have instead we have these beings called the sirens, which people may have heard of before. The sirens first show up in Homer's The Odyssey when the king Odysseus is trying to get back to his family in Ithaca after the Trojan War. And he passes all of these obstacles and all of these challenges and all of these incredible beings and monsters. So one of the things he has to get by is the island of the sirens. And in the Odyssey, we don't get a description of the sirens. All we know is that they are these beautiful singing voices, and that their singing is dangerous, is really fatal for men, because their voices hold knowledge and wisdom that humans can't handle. So again, we see this recurring theme of like the mermaids having something that humans cannot handle, right? Like they have knowledge or they have wisdom or you know, there's something humans cannot handle, cannot have access to. So they are divine beings. They are spiritual beings. They're elevated above humanity. So what Odysseus does is he has all of his sailors plug their ears up with wax, and he has them tie him because he wants to hear it. He wants the knowledge. He has them tie him to the mast of his ship so that he can't get away, so that he can hear the siren song, but he's not able to get away and drive his ship onto the rocks. Because that's what happens is people hear this song, they're too entranced by it, and then they crash their ship. Later, in other versions of the Odyssey story, and as well as other kinds of stories in ancient Greece, the sirens start to be described as kind of scaly bird women. So we see this image right here in the middle from Attica, 370 BC, of the siren as a bird woman. But eventually, because of their association with the ocean, with the sea, they start being represented as more fish-like creatures, sometimes both. Sometimes we see sirens who have kind of bird kind of claws and wings and a fishtail, okay? But there are other antecedents, or there are other precursors or early versions of beings that would kind of make their way into mermaid lore. There's Aphrodite, who I'm sure people have heard of before, who is the goddess of love, a goddess of beauty. Aphrodite, as far as I know, has never been represented as a mermaid. However, Aphrodite's origin story is that she emerged from the sea fully formed inside a clamshell. So there is a pottery vessel here showing Aphrodite inside the clamshell. So a lot of her iconography, and what I mean by iconography are the symbols that are associated with Aphrodite, the clamshell, pearls, her mirror. She was often depicted, you know, looking into her mirror, right? She's sometimes depicted in modern art sitting on like a clamshell throne, right? A lot of this sort of symbols and these kinds of items and things associated with her are also associated with mermaids. There also are these beings in ancient Greece called the nymphs. So the nymphs were sort of lesser spirits beneath the gods and goddesses, but they were more powerful, more divine than humanity. So they were kind of lesser deities, right? Nymphs will often be kind of the retinue or the entourage of a deity, right? So Artemis was the goddess of the hunt in the woods, and she had these nymphs, these nature nymphs that would serve her, right? So there were nymphs that were, they're nature spirits that are associated with all kinds of different natural places. And the water nymphs were called Nereids, or I probably am pronouncing that wrong, but Nereids, right? And so these water nymphs, they were frolic, they were mischievous. Sometimes they were dangerous to humanity, not so much because they were malicious, but just because they didn't care, right? Like the vibe of the nymphs is very kind of like frolicking, sort of childlike, almost kind of teenage girls, right? Like that's kind of the vibe of the nymphs, right? And that's kind of has made its way into our language, right? Like, you know, there's, well, I'm not going to get into that, but there's a whole category or genre of culture called sort of nymphet culture, which is sort of like a fetishizing of like youth and teen culture, right? So this, I also think that the nymphs, which later would be called sort of water sprites, you know, that these kinds of spirits are also precursors to modern mermaid lore. So what do we get with when we get more into the modern period, when we get away from the ancient, right? We have the fall of Rome, we go into the medieval period, and we have the medieval period going to the modern period, right? And so we start to see these images change a lot because now we're in the Christian world, right? So with Christianization, you know, we get a de-emphasis of some of these deities and these gods and these goddesses and these kinds of spirits. So mermaids start to become more, we start to get more of a binary. And what I mean by binary is like, a binary is like opposites. So good, evil, left, right? Man, woman, right? Light, dark, right? So we get more kind of binary thinking and binary culture when we get away from those older religions that were polytheistic religions. So a lot of the older religions, the gods and the goddesses would have different dimensions to them. They could be bad, they could be good, they could be mischievous, they could be cruel, they could be generous, they could be mean, they could be jealous, they could be spiteful, right? Like they had all of these like qualities and characteristics, and so did lesser beings like nymphs and sirens, right? It wasn't necessarily good or evil. What you get with Christianity is more of them being represented as either good or evil, right? So the siren, which by the medieval period is exclusively represented as a being with a fishtail rather than as a bird woman, the siren becomes a figure of temptation, of evil. She represents carnality, so she represents sexuality, and she's a tempter for men. So sirens will frequently be featured in medieval and modern churches as kind of like demonic figures, right? In sort of opposition to the angels. What's interesting about that, though, is that at the same time, there seemed to be this kind of like respect or appreciation for the mermaid. Like during the Protestant Reformation, when, that's when the English, particularly the British, but other kingdoms were challenging the Catholicism, and they were challenging the role of the Pope. And so you had people raiding churches and tearing down the statues of the saints and tearing down the statues of Virgin Mary. They didn't tear down the mermaids, right? So there's actually several examples of churches where the saints and the Virgin were destroyed, but the mermaids were left there. The mermaids were left intact. So we don't really know the reasons for that, but it's very interesting. So I think that they did retain some power and awe for people, even as they started to transform during this period. Another interesting thing about mermaids was they became associated with prostitutes and sex work. So women who were considered loose women or women who were working as sex workers were called mermaids. And a lot of the taverns, because taverns, these kind of bar rowdy places, these weren't places where respectable women were supposed to go. A lot of these taverns were named for mermaids. So it was interesting that even as mermaids became kind of treated as like more evil, carnal beings, at the same time, they were everywhere. Like they were everywhere in like medieval culture. They were everywhere in like early modern culture. One of the most famous mermaid stories, and this is actually the source of my mermaid, one of the sources of my mermaid name, my Mersona. My Mersona is Mommy Melusine. So in the mermaid community, we come up with like characters to represent our mermaid self. So my Mersona is Mommy Melusine, and when I'm combining Mommy Watsa, who's an African water goddess, who I'll talk about later, with the Melusine, who is I'll talk about the Melusine story right now. So Melusine is a French tale of a water fairy. She's not originally described as a mermaid, but over the years, she's been more and more represented as a mermaid. She was a water fairy who, married a king, right? So he came upon this beautiful woman in nature and married her. And she agreed to live with him, bear his children, all of that. But one day a week, he was supposed to leave her alone to bathe by herself. And so when he would leave her alone that one day a week, which I believe was Saturday, is when she will go into her natural form, which is a serpent beneath the waist. And so he had to promise to leave her alone, never look at her. But of course, men, people start to get into his head. He thinks maybe she's being unfaithful. He can't respect her boundaries. And so he spies on her and sees her form. He doesn't immediately say anything about it. But later, when they get into an argument, he calls her a foul serpent, and she knows he saw her. And so she immediately leaves him. She turns into, in some versions of the story, she turns into a dragon, but she turns into some kind of scaled creature, and she flees back to the sea. And so the Melusine is often represented as a dragon, but sometimes she's represented as a mermaid with two tails. And she only returned to nurse her children. And actually, there are royal aristocratic families that trace in Europe that trace their ancestry to the Melusine. So they do like believe she existed. So the Melusine story is one of the popular mermaid stories in medieval literature. Another popular story is the story of the Undine. So the Undine is not actually a mermaid. She is a water sprite, which is basically the modern Western version of a nymph. So she's a water spirit. And in the story, she marries a knight. She's adopted. She washes up on the shore and she's adopted by this family. And she's like this wild kid. You know, she's this wild kid. She's this wild girl. She's saucy. She's sassy. And that's not the proper like behavior of young women during this time period. And so this knight, but she's also incredibly beautiful. So all these men want to marry her regardless. So she marries a knight. And after their wedding night, she is mysteriously tamed. She is suddenly docile and appropriate. And what she tells her husband is that, oh, marrying you gave me a soul, because it turns out that she is a water sprite from this undersea world, and that the beings in that world do not have, actually, I think she's a freshwater. So she's from an under river world. And the beings in that world do not have souls. The only way for her to get a soul is to marry a human knight, a human man. So the story goes on from there. It's a complicated story. He ends up betraying her. She ends up killing him. And then she dies of grief. So this is actually the basis of the Little Mermaid story, right? Because with a lot of these old stories, people just rewrite them, right? Like most of Shakespeare's plays are adaptations of stories that were already existing. So it wasn't, people didn't really plagiarism. It's not really a thing. People would just rewrite these stories, right? And so Hans Christian Andersen. So the Undine is, I can't think of it. It's old. I think it's like 1500. So Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid is in the 1800s that he writes this story, and it's based on the Undine story. So this is explicitly a mermaid, and it has the same idea that she wants a soul. She wants everlasting life. The mermaid finds out that mermaids do not live forever. They live for several hundred years, but then when they die, they become foam on the sea. And they're just there. There's no spirit. Nothing lives beyond them. So the Little Mermaid becomes obsessed with humanity because she wants to live forever, right? This is the thing I always love to point out about the original Little Mermaid story. It's not about the man. It's not about the prince. It's about her desire for everlasting life. So even though Christianity is not mentioned specifically in the Little Mermaid, it's actually like very much a Christian fable. And so her grandmother tells her the only way that you can get a soul is by marrying a human prince, because then his soul will become yours. So this is why she becomes obsessed with the prince, right? And in The Little Mermaid, in Hans Christian Andersen's story, the prince rejects her. So he marries another woman, which means she's going to die upon the sea. And her sisters tell her that she has to kill the prince in order to be able to go back to being a mermaid. But she doesn't want to go back to being a mermaid, right? She doesn't want to die on the sea. She wants to, have everlasting life. And by this point, she's in love with him. So she does not kill the prince, but because of her sacrifice in not killing him, the sky spirits, the spirits of the air, welcome her into their community. And they say that if you fly with us for 300 years doing good deeds, then you will get a soul. So it is sad, it's tragic, but in the end, she does get what she wants. And this story was written for children. This Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales was part of kind of a new idea in the modern Western world of the idea of a child, right? Like previous to the modern period, children were just they were dressed like little adults. They were treated like little adults. They served the purpose of, girls were for marriage, for creating alliances for upper class families. Boys were for inheriting property, and for poor and working people, they were just labor, right? It's not until we get into the rise of the middle class in the 19th century that we start to get the idea of the child and the idea that children are innocent and they're different than us and they need their own literature, right? So The Little Mermaid was part of the beginning of this sort of genre of children's literature. So at the end of the story, Hans Christian Andersen says, if you're bad, it makes the mermaid have to have another 10 years, right? So it becomes this like, way to, you know, try to make children be good, because it's like every time the mermaid sees a child being bad, she gets another 10 year on her sentence before she gets her soul. So I just always thought that was hilarious. So by the time Disney gets the hold of The Little Mermaid, right, in 1989, right, they drop out the religious aspect of it. So they drop out the soul, right? And so you just have Ariel, and they give her a name. She's not named in the original. So you just have Ariel, you know, kind of being obsessed with humanity and obsessed with the prince, you know, because they take out the religious element of it in order to have this kind of, you know, more mainstream kind of pop culture, you know, phenomenon, right? And so that story, the Disneyfied version of the story, has become our very dominant idea of what mermaids look like and what mermaid stories look like. But this kind of tragic love affair is just such a small part of mermaid lore. I skipped over some things I wanted to say about mermaid lore, but I'll leave something for the Q&A, okay? So I'm not sure where I am on time, but I'm gonna keep going, okay? So, because I turned my timer off. So mermaids have become kind of symbols of girlishness, of hyper femininity, of innocence. And I think that that is all part of some of the problems that people had when a young Black woman was cast to be Ariel, because I think that people's ideas of what a Disney princess is and their idea of femininity and womanhood and girlhood and what that looks like are very much shaped by whiteness, right? And so I don't think it's only about the things people say it's about. Some people are like, well, I want the Ariel of my childhood. I'm like, well, go back and watch the movie. You know, like I still watch the original cartoon if I feel like it. You know, you could go, you still have her, like she's still there. But this is a new Ariel for a new generation and for girls like me who never got to have this, right? So some of the conversation about The Little Mermaid, some of the conversation I saw that was a little bit frustrating was people calling Holly, one of my friends in the mermaid community calls her Hilario now, which I think is so funny. So people calling, so Holly as Ariel, right? Hilario, people calling Hilario the first Black mermaid. And I'm like, oh, no, right? Mermaids have been in Black culture for a very long time. Mermaids have even been, Black mermaids have even been in mainstream culture, right? Holly isn't the first mermaid. Disney isn't even the first Disney mermaid in The Little Mermaid. So there was a show called Once Upon a Time that aired from 2015 to 2018. And in that show, Ursula was a Black woman. And there have been several like Broadway productions. There was a stage anniversary production of The Little Mermaid where Queen Latifah was cast as Ursula. And because I define mermaids broadly in terms of any kind of like humanoid sea creature, in my definition, Ursula is also a mermaid, right? And so, you know, we've seen, and in the like world building, in the origin story of Ursula in that show, Once Upon a Time, she actually does start off as a mermaid. She was a beautiful young mermaid with a beautiful young voice, but she was betrayed by a human man, and she transformed herself into this kind of ocean goddess so that she will always have power to never be betrayed again, okay? In 2016, Beyonce's album Lemonade, even though she doesn't actually depict herself as a mermaid with a tail in that album, several of the songs and several of her performances around that time were embodying the Orisha Oshun. So Oshun is a spirit in an African religion called Ifa. which is a Yoruba religion practiced in West Africa and also practiced throughout the world because it came with African people transported through the slave trade. And there's different versions of like African religions that changed as people were brought over to the Americas. So in Cuba, there's Santeria. In South America, there's Umbanda. And so you'll see these same kind of spirits and deities show up in these religions. And these religions kind of combine themselves with Catholicism in the Catholic colonies. And so they would attach some of their deities to like Catholic saints, but they will also attach these deities to figures in popular culture, such as mermaids, right? So the water deities such as Oshun and Yemaya would start to be called mermaids and sometimes depicted as mermaids. So in her album Lemonade, Beyonce had a lot of references to the Orisha, sometimes called a goddess, sometimes called a spirit. I call her an Orisha, Oshun. And Oshun is a spirit of fresh water, of love, of beauty, of honey. She's associated with this beautiful golden color. If you see in this dress that Beyonce is wearing, she's sweet. And so she's called the knife of honey. So she's sweet, but she's sharp. She's fierce, right? So in the first video in this album, Beyonce is like, she's been betrayed by her husband, literally, right? Beyonce and the goddess. And she tears through this town, like destroying everything, like beating up the cars with bats, right? Because Oshun is fierce and powerful and sweet and loving, like she's all of those things, right? So when you look at the Black lore around mermaids, it's more complex, it's more multidimensional, but it actually looks more like the original ancient lore, right, that I was talking about, even in the Greek and the Roman world, right, where they were deities, they were powerful, they had different dimensions to them. It wasn't just like good woman, bad woman, right? There was also a show that came out in 2018 called Siren, which was a show that was on Disney's like adult version of their channel, I think is what Freeform was. And so in the very first shot of the show, the very first shot we get of a mermaid, the first mermaid on screen in that show is a Black mermaid as well. So Black mermaid deities, the first Black mermaids are gods, they're goddesses, they're spirits, they're deities, right? Similar to Western lore, but I think that in terms of Western lore, that has kind of been forgotten a little bit. These deities, these Black deities are still very much, they're still worshiped, they're still honored, they're still very much present in African diasporic cultures. So Mami Wata is a water spirit who is honored throughout Africa. Her name comes from Mother Water, which is a pidgin English for Mother Water. Mami Wata is a name that people use to communicate with the Europeans who were coming to Africa during the colonial period, as well as Africans communicating with one another about their local water spirits. So she's kind of a combination of lots of different local indigenous water spirit lore, as well as with other kinds of influences such as European mermaids and also Indian snake charmers, because there were also a lot of Indian people present in Africa during the colonial period because Britain was also colonizing India, right? So this image of Mami Wata that's become popular throughout Africa is actually an image of a real Indian snake charmer from the 19th century. And I think one of the reasons that image clicked for a lot of African peoples is because in a lot of African cultures, serpents and snakes were sacred. So Mami Wata, I think, moves into the Caribbean where she becomes Mama de Lo, the mother of the waters. And Mama de Lo is an anaconda woman. She is a woman, sometimes she's depicted as like a hag, you know, like in the, you know, like it reminds me kind of like of the Fates, you know, the mother, the maiden, the crone. But sometimes she's depicted as like kind of like more of a mermaid with a whole anaconda body, like a whole snake body. But sometimes she's depicted as more of a mermaid kind of figure. And in Vodun, which is an African diasporic religion practiced in Haiti, we have La Sirène. Lassarin, the mermaid, and she is a version of the goddess of love in that religion, Urzuli. And so Lassarin is, so the thing in African religions is like they both are and they ain't, but I think all religion does that, right? Like even if you look at Christianity, you have Jesus, you have God, they're like Jesus is God, but Jesus is also God's son, right? Like at the same time, you know, you have the same thing in African religions, right? So Urzuli is Lassarin, but Lassarin is also kind of her own thing. So you have that, and then you have Yemaya, who I mentioned before, and Yemaya is a Yoruba Orisha, and she is a goddess of, in Africa, she was actually a river goddess. But through the slave trade, as she traveled with people through the slave trade, she became an ocean goddess. For those of us who are in the Americas, Yemaya is the ocean. Okay, and so she's the mother of the ocean. She's the mother of all Orishas, and she is the protector of pregnant women and children. So these kinds of figures, Yemaya, Oshun, Mami Wata, Mama Delo, they are all very much present in Black literature about mermaids. So this is just a few examples. Suki and the Mermaid was a book that I read as a little girl. It came out in the 1990s, and it's about Mama Jo, who is an African-American version of Mama Delo. And what I find very interesting is that in so many of these mermaid stories, we see the mermaids kind of becoming maternal figures to these young girls, right? And we see that in like all of these books here, and there are several other ones that I could tell you about. So Suki is this neglected girl, and the mermaid kind of protects her and becomes like a surrogate mother to her. In Mother of the Sea, we have Yemaya, and she's actually depicted, in the book, she's depicted with a tail. On the cover, she is not. And she causes a shipwreck of a ship, you know, that is traveling, you know, through the slave trade. So there's a young girl on board this ship who calls out, you know, for help, and Yemaya gives her power to destroy the ship. And Rise of the Jumbies is another, this is a much more complicated plot, so I'm not going to summarize it, but we also see Mama Delo, and we see her here as a snake woman, as an anaconda woman. So these are just a few examples of Black mermaid media, and Black mermaid media frequently incorporates these spirits and goddesses, and we get much more complicated images of what mermaids are. And we often see them as very powerful, and we also often see them as maternal figures, which is not something I think you see a lot in terms of our contemporary Western mermaid lore. So I had a question about, you know, mermaid stories that I'm familiar with and mermaid stories that I like. So one of the main things in my project is I'm interested in the intersection of mermaids and the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. There are a lot of mermaid stories in Black culture that depict mermaids as the outcome of people who went overboard during the slave trade. So I just want to play a couple of like quick examples.
Our mothers were pregnant African women thrown overboard while crossing the Atlantic Ocean on slave ships. We were born breathing water as we did in the womb. We built our home on the seafloor, unaware of the two-legged surface dwellers, until the world came to destroy ours. With cannons, they searched for oil beneath our cities. Their greed and recklessness forced our uprising. Tonight, we were.
Y'all remember how deep it go? Started from the bottom. Y'all remember how deep it go? For y'all had to come back deep.
Okay, so this is a hip hop group. Actually, the rapper that you hear is Daveed Diggs, who actually plays Sebastian in Little Mermaid. So mermaid connections all over the place. And he also was not Frederick Douglass, opposite. He was Thomas Jefferson in Hamilton. The song is talking about this race of mer people, and how humans start drilling for oil, and so there's this whole war between the humans and the mer people. And that really captures one of the things that I'm seeing in mermaid lore a lot these days, which is the mermaid as an eco warrior, right? The mermaid as a defender of the waters, and the mermaid is fighting climate change and fighting human pollution. I'm just going to play the trailer for this film. So that is a short stop motion animation film called The Water Will Carry Us Home by an artist named Gabrielle Tesfaye. And it depicts Yemaya, right, mother of the ocean, transforming people thrown overboard into mermaids. Okay. So there are so many examples of this narrative in Black culture, and that's one of the things I write about in my work. Okay, I know I'm over time. I have one more thing that responded to one of the questions people asked was, are mermaids real? Do I think they're real? What are the sightings? What are the things that mermaids, like, why do people have this idea? I mean, I think that one of the reasons people, if we look at the history of mermaids and that they all start as deities and like water spirits, water goddesses, I think that this is where the history comes from, right? Like, I think humanity will always, and I believe in the spirit world, I believe in faith, but I think that the way that we interpret those spirits are different depending on our cultures, right? And so cultures will always create narratives to reflect their relationship to the natural world, right? And so I think that for cultures that lived close to water and were interdependent with water and dependent on water, they're going to create stories about beings that live in that water, right? So that's one of the explanations of origins. There have been ideas about what kinds of animals or creatures people may have really been seeing when they think they spot mermaids. And one of the biggest culprits is the manatee, pictured up, you know, at the top. I don't think that looks like a human woman, but you know, people think that you know, that maybe sailors who are really drunk, you know, they've been away from women for a long time, they're lonely, and they see something like this. And also manatees nurse their young, like at the breast. So maybe when they're holding their young, it looks like a woman. And there are descriptions of sightings in like sailors' journals that talk about a mermaid nursing her baby. And then their tails kind of have that sort of mermaid fluke thing. There's also another sea mammal called the dugong, which its tail really looks like a mermaid tail. And it's also kind of a large marine mammal. You know, so, you know, these are some of the ideas, right? And actually in Latin American and Caribbean, the word sirena is used for both mermaid and manatee. Okay, like they're used interchangeably. People used to actually kill manatees for their meat with the belief that it could give life and healing, right? Because they were like overlapped with mermaids, like they thought they were the same thing. And mermaid flesh is supposed to give people like longer life and heal diseases and all of that, right? So that's one explanation for it. This idea of whether mermaids are real is actually an idea that scientists were asking themselves throughout the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution in like the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th centuries. Because as they started learning about evolution and as they started categorizing, you know, the science of taxonomy, which is the classification of animals into all of these different genus and species and all of these categories we have for animals, as they started doing that and realizing that, you know, animals have evolved from earlier kinds of creatures, when Darwin proposed that there was an aquatic ancestor for humanity, right? That we evolved from an aquatic ancestor, that made people think, well, maybe mermaids are real, right? So there was this moment in Western science where scientists were engaging with mermaids as a potential missing link between humanity and the animal world. Some of the biggest culprits of these idea of mermaid skeletons, I actually saw one recently. Someone sent me like a news story of this kind of mermaid skeleton. And I was like, that looks like the Fiji mermaid. So the Fiji mermaid was an artifact that was exhibited by P.T. Barnum in the 19th century. I think it was like 1831. He exhibited this in New York. And what it actually is it's like a monkey skeleton that was sold to a fishtail. And these were produced by Japanese people and sold to the West by Japanese sailors. And it's actually an effigy or a figure of a spirit within Japanese mythology called the Ningyo, which is a kind of a fish person, but it's not like a pretty, you know, graceful mermaid, even though now with like Western influences, niños are starting to be represented. It's like Pretty Mermaids, but originally they were kind of these grotesque human head, like fish kind of creatures. And they would, you know, make these like figures of them because they're good luck, they're good fortune. There was the idea that if you caught them, if you ate their flesh, it would provide healing. So again, we see the same kind of ideas like in cultures all over the world. And so they would sell these things to Western sailors who would, you know, come to go to Europe and go to the US and claim they were real mermaids. And then they would be, you know, exhibited and people would pay money to see them. And so some of these scientists from the 19th century who would see these things would say, oh, this must be like our aquatic ancestor, right? They will also like compare them to Black people. There's a whole messy racist history actually connected to this that I could talk about more if you're interested. But do I believe in the biological existence of an aquatic humanoid? No, I don't think that is possible. Our anatomy is not compatible with ocean survival. And even if there was kind of an evolutionary split, that's not really how evolution works. Like it wouldn't be that even, right? Like, oh, half of it is a human, half of it is a fish, right? So biologically, no. There was actually this like documentary that came out. I think it was 2015. I didn't put the year here, but Animal Planet put out this documentary called Mermaids, The Body Found, where they did try to like propose that there was this kind of like ancient aquatic ancestor species living in the oceans. And it was so convincing, and the way that they produced it made it seem really real. A lot of people believed it was real, but it turned out like the whole thing was a hoax. The whole thing was fiction. And it actually changed the way that like Animal Planet and, you know, these different kind of channels had to put sort of disclaimers, right? Like that it wasn't real. But if there was any possibility for a kind of aquatic humanoid, it would have to be more like that. Like it couldn't have skin, it couldn't have hair, it would have no need for a nose. Like it would be so dramatically different from us that I don't think we would recognize ourselves in it, right? So I could talk more about that because there are lots of writers and artists that have attempted to depict like more realistic mermaids, not just pretty magical mermaids, but mermaids who could actually survive the ocean. And I have some examples of those if you're interested. Now, what I believe scientifically is different than what I believe spiritually. I do believe in spirits. I do believe in a spirit world. And I think that when we're talking about a spirit world, when you're talking about faith, when you're talking about the divine, I think miracles can happen, right? And anything is possible, okay? So the only real mermaids I know though in the flesh are me and my friends. So I'm just gonna leave you with a shot of a bunch of mermaids from the Afro Mermaid Summit, which happens every year in Miami, where a lot of the, you know, and it's open to everyone. So there's also non-Black mermaids who come to this, and we just get together and we just enjoy having space in our lives to be whimsical and be magical and just be something other than day-to-day reality. And that's where I'll stop there. And, you know, I'm open to any questions.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. And we're going to open up the stage now for any questions, if anyone has any. This has also been recorded, so I will share this out later today. So if anyone has any questions, we'll give it a few minutes. We might have a quiet group. Like I said, we haven't done Legend Chasers in a few years, so we're just getting into it now.
I'll ask, is it easier for you to swim with your tail or without?
It's actually easier with the tail. Yeah, because the monofin gives you a lot of propulsion. Once you get the rhythm of the kick that you need. So when I first started doing it, it was really hard because I was trying to go too fast. So I actually did like some coaching with the professional mermaid that you saw performing with me. And so you actually go really slow. It's like a very slow, sinuous movement. So it doesn't use a lot of energy. It's a lot of core work, but it doesn't lose a lot of energy. So I could stay, and you want to do it underwater. So I can stay underwater and get across a pool way faster, like with my tail and my monofin, than I can with my legs. So that's a really cool thing about it. You really do. You really have to kind of remind yourself that I can drown because the motion of it, and it will make you feel like you're a mermaid, you know, and you have to remind yourself, no, I actually need air to survive.
All right, any other questions? Rachel, that was a good one. I did see a DIY mermaid tail and I might have saved the video because I was very interested.
I was gonna say, are
Making
there
one.
like places to try them on and like experience it? Because I think Kat and I
Mhm.
might have to go there.
Yes.
Yes. Well, you know, one of the things, so I don't know if you've seen, there's a documentary on a professional mermaids called Mer People on Netflix. I'm in it for a second, you know, I'm not talking. You just like see me on a couple of places because they filmed at some of the events I attended. But one of the things we've been nervous about since mermaiding is becoming more popular, because it used to be a very like word of mouth thing, you know, like the way that I found out about it was somebody I knew, you know, so people could tell you how to do it and how to do it safely. So one of the things we're worried about is that people will try to like make tails and hop in the water. You should not be mermaiding if you're not a strong swimmer. And you should get a tail from one of the reputable manufacturers. And it's hard to know who that is if you're not in the mermaiding community, because now Amazon, eBay, like everyone's selling mermaid tails and they're not all good. You know, the monofins are not all safe. So yes, in the beginning of this culture and this community, 10 years ago or so, people were DIYing, they were making their own tails, but now you can buy them. And I recommend that you get it from a reputable manufacturer. So there's quite a few, but Mertailor is one of them. Finfolk is another one. About the most expensive one you can get that's still safe is FinFun. And they do sell FinFun tails on Amazon. And those are the tails that I have. Since I'm not a professional, I really just kind of do it for myself. I don't feel the need to have like make a big investment in it and have like the best of the best. So that's a good place to start, is with FinFun. And that's about the cheapest where you can get one that is safe.
It's very informative. Now I will not make my own. Now I know. So thank you for that. Well, does anyone have any other questions? If not, I think we could wrap it up for today. Jalondra, thank you so much for this today. This was wonderful. And we'll end it here. Let me just stop the recording.